Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum everyone. And in this semester, I'll be teaching you people the course of Romantic and Victorian poetry. And in this lecture, as it is the first lecture of this course, so I would like to introduce with you people the poetry of 19th century, and particularly that our topic of today's discussion is introduction to the British poetry of 19th century. Okay, let's discuss course outline. The aspects and the topics which we will be discussing in this lecture are introduction to the British poetry of 19th century, in which we will discuss what type of poetry was written in 19th century in Britain. Number 2, literary periods of the 19th century. Yes, literary periods of the 19th century literature. Which literary periods were there during the 19th century? As there are two periods which are Romantic period, and I'll tell you people the characteristics of Romantic period, the common themes. Then we will discuss important poets of Romantic period. Then there is Victorian period, and followed by important poets of Victorian period as well, and then I'll conclude the lecture. Yes. First of all, we will discuss introduction to British poetry of 19th century. Okay, before going further, I would like to tell you people which period is called 19th century, from which year to which year it is called as 19th century. A year starting from 1801 to 1900 is called the period extending from 1801 to 1900 is called as 19th century. And in this period, the poetry that was produced in the British or it was produced in the Britain is called as the British poetry of 19th century. So by Britain, we do not mean only the poets belonging to the England, but poets belonging to the UK, that because UK is a combination of three different states, that is England, Scotland and Wales. So all the poets belonging to these three states, they come in the category of British poets. So common themes of British poetry are love, nature, passion, realism and science. Yes, there's a theme of love found in the poetry of many Romantic poets. We will be discussing later on in this lecture. Then there is theme of nature. As we all know that Romantic poets were basically admirer of nature. They wanted to feel the beauty of nature, and they have expressed and conveyed that their feelings related to the nature through their poetry. The way they love the nature, they have expressed it through their poetry. Okay, number 3 is passion. Yes, passion is something related to the emotions. Passion and emotion, they come in contrast with each other. So they talk about their their passion for something, their emotions for something, their feelings for something. So if we can say that there are feelings, there are emotions in the poetry. Yes. Next we have realism. Yes, if we relate this theme with the theme of science, then we will be able to understand it way much better, because the realism is related to the science. Why? Yes, the question arises why. The answer lies in the fact that at that time, like at the beginning of 19th century, there were many the scientific development that took place in the early 19th later 19th century. These developments were based on science and technology. Industrialization was taking place, urbanization was underway. So because of industrialization, the family structure basically disintegrated. The class system emerged. As a result, people started living their lives in a unit whole, instead of having a big families, having family values, having agrarian society. The society converted into industrial, so people were having less time for each other. As a result, they started that compassion, that understanding between one another, that fade away. So we can say that there was realism. The selfish nature of the people came in front. So those themes are also found in the later in the poetry of late 19th century. Yes, then there was a theme of science, as I mentioned earlier, that there was development of science and technology, which was accompanied by industrialization and urbanization, that also affected the mind and psyche of the people. As a result, they moved away from the family values, from they do not have as close relation to the nature as they had earlier. The urban life, the city life, that prevailed, and people also do not have that level of sincerity with the people. So those themes are also found in the poetry of late 19th century. Yes, there are two important periods of 19th century literature. 19th century literature, or poetry particularly, comprises of poets belonging to two different literary periods. Okay, which periods are they? Number one, that is Romantic period, and number two, that is Victorian period. So the title of our course is also Romantic and Victorian poetry. So in that we will be discussing poets belonging to Romantic period and poets belonging to Victorian periods. Yes, they are almost contrast to one another in sense of their themes, in sense of the features, in sense of their subjects, in sense of the style as well. They have their own distinct qualities. Both the periods, their works, their literature, their poetry, everything had their own characteristics. So we will be discussing such characteristics later on, I mean in the later lectures. But in this lecture particularly, I'll be introducing the poets of Romantic and Victorian period. Yes, Romantic poetry. So before going into the detail in discussing what Romantic poetry is, I would like to tell you people the time period during which Romantic poets had written poetry. It is the period extending from 1798 to 1837, and so this time period is known as Romantic period in the history of English literature. And because it was in this period particularly, Romantic poets had produced such works which became masterpieces. Okay, just give me a hint of those poets, like Wordsworth, Keats. They belong to this age. I'll be discussing these poets and their works as well. For now, just had that idea. Okay, so the poetry written in this period is called Romantic poetry. All right, so definitely it is because of that period which is classified in the history of English literature, that this period is particularly called as Romantic period. Okay, so we will discuss the features of Romantic poetry, what type of features this poetry have. By features we also mean characteristics. The Romantic poetry had the following characteristics. There is imagination. Yes, imagination is one of the most important feature of Romantic poetry, because most of the poems that poets had written, they were based on their own imagination, that they were based on their own fantasy. You can just imagine that if you want to fly, you can become a bird. If you want to be free, you can become a cloud. All right. So there was some kind of imagination. In imagination, you can do everything you want to do in this world. All right. So that was a feature of Romantic poetry. Poets used to imagine situations. They used to imagine themselves to be in some kind of situation, and then they used to depict their feelings, express their feelings through the poetry. Okay, love for nature. Romantic poets had a great love for the nature. Okay, they wanted to live in the pastoral settings. Pastoral settings mean the village sides. Wordsworth, Yes, he wanted to live in such places which were full of nature, the greenery, the tree, the flowers, the sky, the clouds. So he wanted to feel the nature, feel the beauty of nature. And he had expressed that nature, or the you can say the beauty of nature, with his companions, with his readers as well. Number three is sensuousness. Sensuousness is related to the senses. It means whenever you read a piece of text, a piece of poetry, there are words that arouse the senses. If there are words which appeal to your sense of sight, it means that you are looking at that thing. If there are words which appeal to your hearing sense, so it means you are hearing something. For example, in Keats' poem, that is Ode on a Grecian Urn, he said, "Heard melodies are sweet, and those unheard are sweeter." Heard melodies. So there's a word heard. So heard, it represents some kind of sense, it appeals to your senses, that is related to the sense of hearing. So we can say that this is what we call sensuousness. That was also prevalent in the poetry of romantic poets. All right. There is theme of supernaturalism. This its feature, as one of the features of romantic poetry is supernaturalism. We found this feature in the poetry of S.T. Coleridge, in his poem that is The Rime of Ancient Mariner, where there is an element of supernaturalism. Then when we will study this poem, then we will look into it in detail. Okay, Hellenism, it is a kind of characteristics of uh, literary work in which relates to the Helen. Helen was a Greek goddess. She was a goddess of beauty, and so everything that is related to the Greek myths or Greek mythology is called as Hellenistic. All right. So Keats has used Hellenistic element in his poem that is Ode on a Grecian Urn, because it was related to the Greece. It was a Greek urn. Yes, escapism is one of the characteristics or the features of romantic poets used to escape. They do not want to face the reality. They wanted to just disappear from the situation. They wanted to be lost in their own on state of mind that was based on imagination. Here we have romantic poets. Although I have given you just a taste of romantic poetry by narrating some verses from the poems of different poets, but here particularly I'll tell you people the important works of these poets. Number one, we have William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth, along with Coleridge, he had written their masterpiece, that is Lyrical Ballads, in 1798, and the publication of 1798 marked the beginning of Romantic period. Just keep that thing in mind. So other works of Wordsworth include Tintern Abbey, Intimations of Immortality, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, and yes, the Prelude. It is a collection of poems by William Wordsworth. Okay, William Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge, as I mentioned earlier, they have worked in collaboration with one another because they have published their Lyrical Ballads in 1798. So I would like to mention some other works of S.T. Coleridge. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, I have already mentioned. Then there is Christabel Kubla Khan, that was published posthumously. Alright, so there is an element of supernaturalism in his poem, that is The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Here then we have Percy Bysshe Shelley, also known as P.B. Shelley, and Shelley's most famous poem is Ode to the West Wind, because its ending verses are if winter comes, can spring be far behind? So you might have heard it somewhere. Yes, To a Skylark, Adonis, a Dirge, Ode to Liberty. So they are poems of Shelley. Then we have John Keats. Yes, Yes, who does not know Keats? Well, he's one of the most famous poets of Romantic age, and his poems include To Solitude. It was his first collection. Then he also wrote Ode on a Grecian Urn, Ode to a Nightingale, Ode to Psyche, Ode to Autumn, Endymion, and Hyperion. Yes, there are other poems as well. Okay, then we have Victorian poetry, and the period extending from 1837 to 1901 is called Victorian period. It was particularly the age in which Queen Victoria reigned the England. She was the head of the England, so this age is named after her. In her era, there was a hell lot of development that took place in the field of literature, and there were prose writers, there were novelists, there was poets who produced masterpieces in this time period. Okay, so the poetry written in this period is called Victorian poetry. Because of its name, we call it as Victorian poetry. Yes, and there are different many features of Victorian poetry, and few of them are mentioned here: realism, pessimism, science and technology. Yes, realism, as I mentioned earlier, that uh, people started facing reality more than ever. Before that, they used to live in the among the fields. There was agrarian society based on agriculture mode of earning. But later on, it shifted from agrarian to industrial. As a result, people moved from villages to the cities. They settled there. They had the limited time. There was hustle and bustle everywhere. People used to have less time for each other's companionship. So the selfish nature of the men dominates. That is why there were realist themes in the poetry. So that is why realism was one of the features of Romantic poetry. Then there was pessimism. Yes, because of the competition, the emerging competition, because of the rising middle class. There was pessimism because family values were declining, family circles were degenerating, we can say. So there was pessimism. People were not, they lost hope. They were not able to enjoy the life as they used to enjoy it formerly. Then there are themes of science and technology. Yes, and there's a mention of such elements in this poetry because of the industrialization, science and technology had developed a great deal. So we also find such themes in the poetry of Victorian era. Yes, important poets are Alfred Lord Tennyson. Yes, Alfred Lord Tennyson wrote poems which are In Memoriam, Locksley Hall, The Princess, Maud, Idylls of King, The Lotus Eater. There were different poems that were written by Lord Tennyson. Then we have Robert Browning. He wrote such poems as Pauline. It was his first poem. Yes, Paracelsus, dramatic lyrics, dramatic romances and lyrics, and there was his masterpiece, that is The Ring and the Book. Later on, we have Matthew Arnold, and he wrote Empedocles on Etna, Tiresias. All right. So it is basically an elegy. Elegy is something which is written on the death of someone. And then we have D.G. Rossetti, Daniel Gabriel Rossetti, and he wrote sonnet The House of Life. He was poet as well as painter. And then there is Christiana Rossetti. They were brother and sister. So Goblin Market and Other Poems, 1861. The Prince's Progress in 1866. So they were the Victorian poets of this era. So in this poetry, in this subject, we will be looking into detail the poetry of these poets. We will discuss their features. We will discuss the stylistics, or the style of their poems, which figurative devices have been used, which themes have been worked upon, which subjects have been chosen for discussion. So we will be looking into detail about their poems later on in this course. So that's all for today, and I hope you would have understood it well. Thank you.